Hello, welcome to our conversation. This half hour is a conversation. Basically, it has the affirmation that the story matters. Your story matters, our story matters, everyone's story matters, and it gives us a chance to talk about stories and storytelling. So we're glad to have as a conversational partner Charlotte Barrett. She works for Historic New England, and she has a connection with Sheldon. So I'll let Charlotte tell about that.
Yes. Yes, well, I'm the Community Preservation Manager for Historic New England, and we are the oldest and largest regional heritage organization in the country. We have historic sites in all the New England states except Vermont, not yet here. And we preserve and share history through our 36 museum properties and through our archives and collections, which is quite extensive, and through public programming and school programs. And we currently have an alliance with the Henry Shelton Museum through August of next summer. And really combining resources. We're actually quite the same in terms of having a very extensive archives and collection from which to draw on for exhibitions and public programs, and both were founded by men who were very committed to preserving history through that.
Men who are committed to preserving history. Can you tell a little bit about the story of the person who
William Sumner Appleton was the founder of Historic New England, and he's founded it in 1910. He was really one of the first people to notice the loss of historic resources and feared that history was being lost along with those buildings. And so he had the means to acquire properties, and then he would open them to the public. And along the way also collected, a lot of these properties came with collections, and so they were already set up to share their particular story. And of course, over time, Historic New England has collected a lot more for both its, in terms of archival material as well as objects in its collection.
Yeah, and I'm sure you've learned a lot about Henry Shelton.
Yes, yes.
Interesting character.
Yeah, yes, he is. And he didn't collect buildings, but he collected plenty of objects and everything else. So it's fascinating archives. I've had a tour of it, and I think one of the ways we're hopeful of working with the Sheldon Museum is to lend some of our lengthy experience in terms of how to manage collections to their efforts.
Let me take you back to an early time. When you were young, and did you think about being in the historic field? Did you? Who told you stories when you were young? Were you the storyteller, or was someone else?
Yeah, I think at first I was the lucky beneficiary of storytelling. My grandmother was someone, she and my grandfather lived in a very, like a Tudor revival house out in Cleveland, Ohio, and she was someone who had a real revered the past, and they had a lot of antiques, a lot of things that were associated with family history. And so when we would go to visit, my sisters and I, part of our time there was spent on these informal tours through the house, and she would share pieces of family lore about objects in the house. And it definitely had a strong impression on me. My sisters and I laugh about this one particular piece of furniture. It was a horsehair couch, extremely uncomfortable. When you sat on it in shorts, your legs were all prickled. So not something you'd really want to have in your house, but it had this wonderful history of having gone across the country to Washington State in a covered wagon. And so my one sister simply cannot get rid of that couch because she loves this story. So I think that I really developed a love for story and the power of it as a way that we connected to our family, but also to the particular times that those stories took place. So.
Did you think of yourself as in the historical framework, becoming involved?
In the field? Not
the field?
really, but I did, when I graduated from college, I headed towards journalism, so storytelling in its own right. But then had a friend who was very involved in working with Senator Paul Tsongas on the rehabilitation of the Lowell industrial areas, and became involved that way in historic preservation. So the storytelling continues when you're interpreting historic sites and objects.
What does it mean, really, to someone who likes stories to have an archives, where you have all these objects and this past history? I mean, is it sort of like Christmas morning?
It is. It's you know, the important thing is, when you have an archives where you don't know the story behind those objects, they lose they have meaning when you can put them into the context of a story. And so that's the challenge for a lot of small historical societies that have wonderful archives, but don't know the history of something, the provenance, where it came from. And so it's a good question as to whether there's a value to that object without that story behind it. And I think collecting organizations always grapple with that.
The Tunbridge historic...
the History Expo?
History Expo.
Yeah.
I know I was going to miss that. Was this recently.
Yeah.
And I saw some pictures, and there was this one display where they just had built a kitchen, and so that you could get a sense of what the kitchen was like in the historic time. That sounds like an exciting time.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think, and it's interesting because kitchens are are so universal, and we associate them so much with family and being together and good food that people love to see historic kitchens. And I think a lot of historic sites are that originally perhaps thought people wouldn't be interested in that, realize now that the stop in the kitchen is one of their favorite places, and learning about the domestic servants that supported the house, you know, from the background.
Right, with the button in the floor.
Yeah.
Or the tug on the rope to the bell.
Exactly, yes.
We had a house that I lived in at one point that had the button on the floor, and I asked whether it was connected. They said no one would respond if it was.
Yes, my grandmother's house actually had one of those too, buried under the rug.
So when people think of history, I remember when we were in school, there would always be one class where the students would sort of agree that was a topic they didn't like. You know, what was, and sometimes it would be math, sometimes it would be, but often it would be history. What have you learned about how we help change that attitude?
Yeah. I think really approaches to teaching history, I can't speak so much for in the school system, but I know that for museums there's just been a real revolution in thinking about how we help people to make personal connections to history, and that if you want it to resonate for them, it needs to somehow tie into something they know or that has meaning for them. So, you know, a lot of the school programs will try to make, you know, a tie into kids. You know, how does your mom cook in the kitchen, and what do you think it would be like to cook over an open fire? And so somehow to try to make that link for them, and you know. Each person, you could go to a museum with somebody and see the exact same exhibit and walk away with a very different impression, or have really focused on something very different based on what set of memories and experiences and knowledge you have when you go in. So that's the challenge and the exciting opportunity of working in a museum and developing educational programs and exhibitions.
Beyond your grandmother, have there been some storytellers in your work that you really have been impressed with?
Well, I'll digress a little bit because I've just started working for Historic New England, but we actually have a program called Everyone's History, and it's our community engagement piece of what we do. And that means that instead of developing programs that attract people to our own sites, we go out into communities and we work with a local group who is interested in telling a story about their history. So in Vermont, our most recent project was in Norwich, Vermont, where we worked with some local organizations to develop a documentary film about their one-room schoolhouses. And it's called Back to School: Lessons from Norwich's One-Room Schoolhouses. And it a really important component of that, and always with these local community projects we do, is oral histories. So because we feel it's important to not just be collecting buildings and objects, but memories that are so elusive and they'll be gone when that person passes on. So we interview people and they become part of an archive, just like this will. And those become typically a piece of whatever that project is, whether it is that they are on film or their voice is on film, or if we do an exhibition, we might have an audio recording with an image of that person. So I've listened to a lot of our film or oral histories in those films, and just have taken such pleasure in hearing people light up when they are telling their personal stories about what it was like to, arrive at school and everybody had to chip in to build the fire in the stove to warm it up, or there was a funny outtake in the Norwich film. We didn't make it into the actual film, where two brothers were just having so much fun laughing about all the mischief they got into in school. So that's the sort of thing I really enjoy.
Some people would have wished that they had gotten into the film, I think, because probably that's what they did.
Yeah.
We all have some kind of history like that. Yeah. So, what's your part in the project like that? If you put together a project,
so,
what do you find yourself doing?
I'm trying to get the next one going in Vermont. And it's going to be on Vermont's Granges and the history of the Grange, but also hopefully trying to make a link between the past and its continuing relevance in the present. And certainly Granges have been struggling in terms of membership, and many of them are closing all over the country. But in a state like this, Granges are so essential to the rural history and tradition that we're hopeful that we will locate a Grange or two as our partners to work on some sort of a project that celebrates that history and its ongoing importance. Those Granges that are still active have less of an agricultural focus, but they are still very much part of the community. They do a lot of community service work. They're there for their members when they go through tough times, which is what traditionally, when farmers were living very isolated lives, they really relied on each other. And so I'm in the process still of trying to locate a couple of Granges who would like to work with us. And we will be working also with the Vermont Folklife Center, helping us do the oral histories, and the Preservation Trust of Vermont would like to be part of that, as well as the Vermont State Grange has been quite supportive. So we're slowly building that.
Yeah, I had a friend who was going to retire sometime in the future, and he got nervous, he said, "What will I do?" And he went out and got a master's degree in American history. So, and he later became a teacher in about 4 different colleges.
After retirement?
After retirement. And so, do you find, as you go about your work, you find people who really get excited like that, wanting to be part of capturing history and the heritage?
Definitely. I mean, I think, I think communities are recognizing how important their history and preserving that history is to really remaining vital, and that they can capitalize on that history in terms of drawing tourists to their towns, that there's a real different feeling about being rehabilitating one of their old buildings for use over building a new one, if it's at all possible, because that building is just imbued with, the story.
Maybe you could tell a little bit about the Grange, in case there's some folks who are watching and will say, "Yeah, I remember the Grange," and they might want to connect up with you.
Yeah, exactly. You mean what
your Grange project might look like?
So the thing about our Everyone's History program is that we leave it to our partner to decide how they want to tell that story. So, for example, we have done quite a few films lately, because it's been a nice way to get it out. And, we can do it on the internet. It can be on YouTube, so it gets a really broad audience. But we've also done exhibitions, and actually the Sheldon Museum, back in, I believe it was 2012, we did an exhibition with them on the Addison County Fair.
Oh, yeah.
And that was one of the first collaborative projects we did, where we developed the panels, the exhibition panels, and did some of the archival research. And the Sheldon Museum contributed artifacts and photographs.
That exhibit.
Yeah.
You know what impressed me the most? Well, everything did, but really what caught my attention was that every single picture that was in that exhibit told a story even without the words. But then over here there were the words that someone, had put into the process.
Yeah.
But just looking at there were just great solid pictures of people, just ordinary people going to the county fair.
Yeah, and that's what's kind of fun about films, is that when you do the oral histories, you can have an entire film without a narrator, because the thread of your various conversations can end up supporting any archival images you use or ephemera, and it's just it's a very personal way to interpret those images.
Yeah. So that process is still in the making,
Yes.
right? Okay. Are there other projects that you're working on now?
The other thing that
have worked on?
I've spent a lot of my time really just becoming familiar with the state and meeting a lot of people. We do have a stewardship program, our preservation easement program, which is a way that we work with private property owners to preserve their homes. They donate an easement to Historic New England, which means that it's written into the deed, and it ensures that the property, just like in land conservation, that the property cannot be demolished or neglected. It must be maintained, and it passes with the title to subsequent owners in perpetuity. So it's a way that we can, without investing in properties and without taking properties off the tax rolls, we can work with people in communities to keep as much of their historic architecture in good condition and continuing to be a part of the community.
Do you have any generational observations about storytelling? I know that if you're a certain age and you can actually remember when we had kerosene lamps and all those, a churn in the, or whatever, there's a kind of an interest. But any observations about other generations that have...
About the interest in history? I think that there is still a lot of interest in that. I think kids, or young people today, tell their stories differently. They use a lot of social media. I know that they use Instagram and they tweet and they use Facebook and share in all these sorts of ways. My son, I remember going to the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston with him a couple of years ago, and there was an exhibition of Jamie Wyeth's paintings, and one of his paintings was of Arnold Schwarzenegger, and I watched my son take a photograph on his cell phone and post it on Instagram with his own interpretation of that, based on his cultural context and age, and all those cultural references that he had as somebody who was in his a 20-year-old.
Right.
So passing a story on of sorts.
Yeah.
In that way.
That's encouraging. That's real.
Yeah.
When you think about it.
Yeah, well, a lot of museums, they really take advantage of Instagram, and they encourage people to take photos and post them on Instagram and hashtag them with the name of the museum, so that the word gets out. So it's just, most of them are embracing it.
Yeah. So the museum world is changing all
Definitely.
the time, right?
Yeah.
And it's exciting, right?
I think so.
That's great, and so it's worth putting your energy into, and
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's great. So, what else would you, when you think about stories, what else would you want to share with us about why stories are important and what we might learn from stories that maybe you haven't touched on?
Well, I don't know. I was thinking about that before this morning and thinking that storytelling has become it's become a really widely used term now. I mean, certainly in the state of Vermont, there is your program.
Right.
Last year's fall conference in the Vermont Humanities Council was Why the Story Matters.
Right.
There's the new Vermont Story Lab, which is an initiative, a consortium of groups funded by the Vermont Community Foundation that are working to create a resource for nonprofits that want to get their story out. So I think stories are something that have been there since there was language, but that we're starting to and have been sort of intrinsic to how we connect with one another, and we're now realizing the power of them, and that we can learn to be better storytellers for many reasons. So,
do you have an early memory of a museum that you went to that sort of may have sparked all this?
Well, the same grandmother that I was telling you about,
grandmother.
she was my family historian. Yeah, she, when we used to go there were a lot of museums around University Circle in Cleveland, and there was the Western Reserve Historical Society that I remember very powerfully, both as and in many, with all my senses. I distinctly remember the smell in there, sort of that, I don't know how to explain it, but it was an old smell. And I remember different sections of the museum, like the antique cars, or there were doll houses, very elaborate doll houses. And that was probably one of my earliest memories. Plus, it was always air conditioned on hot summer days. So we appreciated going to the museum for that reason too.
Yeah. Mine was I lived in a Dutch town in Michigan called Holland, which is about as Dutch as you can get, I guess. And there was a man who had spent his whole life carving, and he had created a Dutch village, a miniature Dutch village.
Oh my gosh.
And it was just incredible. And every time we had a chance to go to that museum, I went because there was always so much more to see and to hear, and then it was very powerful influence upon my life
Yeah.
at a very early time. Well, it's very exciting that you're the work that you're doing, and we appreciate the chance to spend this time together.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah.
And I love the alignment between your program and what Historic New England is trying to do to tell these stories from history. So,
Good.
yeah.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.